Hello viewers, welcome to our program. In today's program, we shall discuss a poem titled A Father to His Son by Carl Sandburg. Carl Sandburg was one of 20th century America's finest poets, writer, biographer, and editor. He was a central figure in the Chicago Renaissance and is best known for his magnificent biography of Abraham Lincoln and his early realistic verse celebrations of Chicago. In his poem, A Father to His Son, a father is giving his son a set of guidelines and values to steer, which help him to steer through the uncertainties and complexities of life. The father wants to suggest values that will help his son lead a meaningful life and a satisfying existence. This poem is a significant piece of American poetry which was written in the year 1936. Before we take up a detailed analysis of this poem, let us talk about the importance of the Chicago Renaissance. The first year of World War I, 1914, has been called by scholars a year of revival in poetry, a literary revolt, or the Chicago Renaissance in literature. The term was not applied until years later when the cumulative influence of poets such as Sandburg, first published in that year, could be analyzed. More than 50 years has passed since New Englanders such as Emerson, Thoreau, Whittier, and Longfellow had dominated American arts and letters. Other sections of the country had their emerging giants such as Washington Irving, Walt Whitman, and Herman Melville around New York, Joel Chandler Harris in the South, and Bret Harte in the West. But none of these were of sufficient depth and breadth to be termed a movement, the Chicago Renaissance. This Renaissance was a watershed in the American culture. It demonstrated that America's interior had matured. Most of these writers were originally from small, middle western towns and decried the loss of traditional values, rural values, in the increasingly industrialized and materialistic American society, and the failure of the romantic promise that hard work would automatically bring material and spiritual rewards. Most of these writers were deeply affected by the regionalism of the 1890s that foreshadowed the realism of the 20th century literature. The Chicago Renaissance was the growing development of literary activity in Chicago during the 1900s and 1920s. The Renaissance lasted approximately 13 years from 1912 to 1925. The leading writers of this Renaissance were Theodore Dreiser, Sherwood Anderson, Edgar Lee Masters, and Carl Sandburg. They realistically depicted the contemporary urban environment. They focused on the increasing industrialization of American society as well as loss of traditional rural values and their accompanying romantic ideals. The period also encompassed the revitalization of journalism as a literary medium. Writers such as Floyd Dell, Anderson, Dreiser, and Sandburg all were associated at one time with the Chicago newspapers. Writing during the first quarter of the 20th century is more often than not critical of American society. The tone is satirical, the stereotyped America is made fun of, and the American dream is shown to be an illusion. In their opposing ways, the two most important poets in the first decade of the 20th century were Edward Arlington Robinson and Carl Sandburg. They decided to explore the quality of American life and to report about it with truthfulness. Now, as from the beginning, poets tended to be divided into the traditionalists and innovators. Robinson and Sandburg represent these two styles. Robinson uses conventional meter and rhyme to paint wry and condensed scenes of man's responses to a hard life. There is the typical tone of this period, pessimism and disillusionment. Sandburg, on the other hand, was a breaker of conventions. He saw greatness in ordinary man and in man's capacity to create a society in which inequalities would be erased and dreams reached. His poems represent 19th century idealism and 18th century faith in political and social change. Realism was the dominant writing style of this period. Poetry also thrived during this realist period. Three Midwestern poets in particular make up what was called the Chicago School of Poetry. The poetry of this school usually focuses on ordinary people, the life of the individual. Three Midwestern poets who grew up in Illinois and shared the Midwestern concern with ordinary people are Carl Sandburg, Vachel Lindsay, and Edgar Lee Masters. Their poetry is often concerned with obscure individuals. They developed techniques of realism, dramatic renderings that reached out to a larger readership. They are a part of the Midwestern or Chicago school that arose before World War I to challenge the East Coast literary establishment. Carl Sandburg was considered by many to be a modern-day Walt Whitman because of his simple, childlike rhymes. Sandburg was an eminent figure of the Chicago Renaissance and the era encompassing World War I and the Great Depression. Carl Sandburg, the early 20th century poet, focused on his hometown of Chicago as the subject of his first published book, Chicago Poems, in the year 1916. His Chicago Poems, upon its initial publication in the year 1916, was greeted with mixed reaction, with many reviewers finding its subject matter startling and its prosaic poetry oddly structured. Nevertheless, the volume proved a career-making event and is generally regarded as one of Sandburg's finest poetic achievements. In Chicago Poems, his major collection and one of his most respected works, Sandburg employed images and topics not commonly considered poetical to paint realistic portraits of ordinary people in such environments as the railroad yard, the marketplace, and the factory. Chicago Poem, with its humanistic rendering of urban life, place descriptions, and casual assemblage of character sketches, provides a stark but idealized view of the working class. Chicago, the centerpiece of the work and one of Sandburg's most celebrated poems, not only portrays the falls of the Midwestern metropolis, but also praises what Sandburg considered the joy and vitality integral to the life there. His poems introduced loud, strong, proud, free verse poetry as a weapon against capitalism. He successfully grabbed readers' attention through his exquisite use of language and introduced them to the horrors of industrialization by taking them inside his city. From childhood, Sandburg loved and admired the legacy of President Lincoln. For 30 years, he sought out and collected material and gradually began writing of the 6-volume definitive biography of the former president. Sandburg composed his poetry primarily in free verse. Free verse poetry does not have a regular rhythm or rhyme pattern. Sandburg's free verse has lines with any number of syllables, irregular rhyme pattern, and lines of varying length. We now move to the next segment of this topic, where we discuss the theme of the poem. In the poem A Father to His Son, the person who is speaking is an observer who is imagining what he thinks the father might say to his son and the advice he might give to him. The observer is thinking about what he would say if it was his son. The argument, thesis, or subject of the poem is life in general and maturation process. The son is moving from boyhood to manhood, and his father wants to impart the knowledge that he has learned over the years from his experience and mistakes to his son, so that he will not have to make the same ones. The genre or form of the poem is a narrative one, written in the year 1936. The structure of the poem is thematic because in the poem there is uncertainty and some conflict. The poem makes use of the setting by not really having a setting, so that this scenario can apply to anywhere where this problem arises. The setting is that there is a father and a son, and then possibly someone who is observing them. The father in this poem seemed more flexible and open-minded. He tried to show his son many images of what the possible outcomes of life would be. He encouraged his son to pursue his own interest and be independent. The father considers saying to the son, "Life is a soft loam, be gentle." In these lines, Sandburg explains the qualities and benefits that come from being hard as well as soft in certain situations in life. He personifies slack moments with needing to be tightened by his son's toughness, and how gentleness will prevail when lashes or tough blows in life strike him. Although this is presented as an intimate letter from a father to a son, the generality of the message Sandburg is portraying can be beneficial to anyone. He poetically summed up a lot of things like learning to be yourself, how to independently make decisions, and becoming comfortable with who I am. In his poem, A Father to His Son, poet says, "Life is hard, be steel, be a rock." In this line, he is relating how life is difficult and his son must be like a rock. The quest of looker into a dry, thwarted worm. In this line, we see a metaphor. The poet is teaching a moral in which it is stating that men can be easily bought and turned in the bad direction over money. Tell him to be many fools. Through these lines, the poet shows how in society many will criticize him for being different and trying to progress, but it is for this reason that he should embrace progression and leave the skeptics behind, because in reality they are the fools. The father in this poem wanted his son to seek the ambitious way. At the end of the poem, the author mentions some eminent personalities like Shakespeare and the others because he wanted his son to understand these people who worked hard and set themselves apart from the society. The father in the poem is a person who believed that life should contain both work and entertainment. In the beginning of the poem, we see a father who sees his son nearing manhood and tells the son that courage or inner strength is very important. An example of a storm could be if the son ever gets into difficult financial times to persevere and not give up. The father tells his son that gentleness and compassion are important, which can be seen in the lines from 8 to 12. The flower is used as a metaphor because when people think of flowers, they usually think of frailty and not strength. And yet, through their frailty, they are still able to break what people consider to be hard and unbreakable rock, which even by natural elements can be quite brutal. This advice relates to the son being a rock and being like steel, because the father says that being gentle like a flower can break even the hardest person who does not show any emotion. His father basically says that showing emotion is not all that bad. The lines where the father tells his son that it is important to have strong personal goals are in the lines 14 and 15. The warning that the father gives right after this advice is that even though there is nothing wrong with wanting money and trying to achieve an economic status where he can live comfortably, possessing too much money is a bad thing and can corrupt him as a person and leave him with a dead conscience, all because he is blinded by his greed. The goals that are implied by the words rich, soft, wanting in line 14 are that the son should work toward his goals if he wants to become wealthy. However, he should not be so intent upon these goals that they should drive him to become greedy. He should be focused upon attaining his business and personal goals. He tells his son not to be so focused upon achieving them that he misses out on life and determines whether his life was successful or not according to those goals. Further, in lines 22 to 27, we find the father tells his son that humility is the most important and that he should not think of himself as a perfect person. The father believes that humility is important so that the son can recognize his faults and understand that he is not infallible. That way, he would have a better perspective on life and be in a better position to correct the mistakes of others. The line where the father tells his son to be true to himself can be seen in line number 29. The white lies and the protective fronts are the means of justification that his son might use to make a wrong look right. It will deaden his conscience to lying, so it will become easier and easier for him to lie later on. The white lies and protective fronts will hurt him in the long run because people will eventually discover that he is a liar and will not want to work with him. His father tells his son to cultivate his own personal individuality and also to develop his natural abilities and talents, which can be seen in line 36. The sense in which the son will be lonely, according to the line 42, is that if the son follows the advice of the father, he will not have very many people that he can relate to, because many people do not listen to the advice of their elders who have learned from their experiences. The father is telling his son that he will have to set himself apart from the majority if he listens to his advice. In this poem, we find the poet uses imagery by giving character description of different types of people. It describes greedy people as worms, gentle people as flowers, and hard and callous people as rocks. It also describes people who heed advice as exceptional by comparing them to famous people. One of the key statements that is important to understand the meaning of this poem occurs in lines 42 to 45, which says, "He will be lonely enough to have time for the work he knows as his own." Here, he was trying to convey to the reader, first of all, that if the son does follow his father's advice, then he truly will be alone, since many people don't like to heed advice. At least this is according to the author. This last sentence is important because the father wants his son to realize that life is short and there is a lot to experience in the world. With that said, the son should not be too eager to start his career right away, which will take up most of his adult life, but wait a while and experience some things. In this poem, the poet uses other literary elements such as repetition, personification, and alliteration. The poet's way of writing is very creative, by which he conveys that life cannot serve anyone. Life is just a word to explain human nature. The father in this poem encouraged his son to explore and take risk in life because he believes that life should be fun. In Carl Sandburg's poem, A Father to His Son, the poet uses a metaphor in each line to meticulously describe what he would like his son to become as he approaches manhood. Sandburg uses foreshadowing in the first two lines to express how the greed that coincides with money has made the souls of men rot before they physically died. He then goes on by personifying dead worms to describe the unsuccessful attempts that men have made to get rich. In the poem, Sandburg uses a large number of metaphors as already mentioned. Life is hard, be steel, be a rock is one of the metaphors used in his poem. This metaphor is comparing a bump on the road to giving up. Put a brave face on and prepare for anything that might try knocking him down. Another metaphor that is used in the poem was life is a soft loam, be gentle, go easy. This means that he shouldn't always be in a rush to do or get a thing, that he should take time and let life happen the way it was intended to happen the way, and not the way the son would think of getting whatever it is faster than it is natural. Another metaphor used in this poem is sometimes into dry, thwarted worms. This means to be in constant control of his life, that it can get boring and very dried up, and there will be less of spark of interest after a long time of the repeated behavior. Sandburg also uses in his poem double meanings when he uses the analogy of the flower splitting the rock. The flower represents gentleness in character as well as the connotation of frailty. The rock represents desensitized character as well as the connotation of strength. This poem doesn't make any specific references to any particular literary works from the past. The poem does, however, make references to specific people who were famous. They include Shakespeare, Wright brothers, Pasteur, Pavlov, and Michael Faraday. The qualities the poem invokes in the reader is that one is supposed to reflect on one's life and think what one would say to a son who was growing up. Think about what one would tell the younger generation. Sandburg is amongst the most beloved of American writers, in part because of his affection for incorporating the nation's law within his works. He was an immensely popular writer and remains a much anthologized American poet. Sometimes Sandburg is compared to such poets as Robert Frost and Walt Whitman because in his writings he showed a parallel interest in America. Sandburg's name will forever be connected to the memory of President Abraham Lincoln, about whom he wrote so much and so well. Sandburg received the Pulitzer Prize many times for his collection The Complete Poems of Carl Sandburg, Cornhuskers, and for his biography of Abraham Lincoln, the War Years. Sandburg was an activist and a man of the people. He believed strongly in workers' rights and had a great optimism about his ability to change the fates of common people. He indicated this politically and with his involvement with the Socialist Party and later with the Democratic Party. He also used in his poetry to express some of his political views. As stated before, in most of his poems, he celebrated the beauty and realistically displayed the tragedy of urban industrial life. His experiences of working and traveling greatly influenced his writing and political views. To conclude about the poet, Sandburg truly was a man of people, one of the most widely acclaimed American poets of the first half of the 20th century. Sandburg wrote this poem, A Father to His Son, with the intention of conveying that life is hard and show how a father speaks to his son about the things that the world has to offer and how and what he needs in order to make it far in life. It also shows what the child is in need of in order to survive and not let things get the best of him. This poem has a universal appeal and is still quite applicable today, in the sense is that you should listen to your elders and learn from them because they teach from their experience. It can be applied to any time in history. I hope you enjoyed our today's program. We'll see you soon in our next program. Thank you.